Welcome to the Stewardship Podcast, where your host, financial advisor Andrew Mitchell, talks with industry experts to help you steward your time, talents, and money.
Welcome to the Stewardship Podcast. Today we have the special honor of having Heather Roby with us. She is the founder and life coach at Joyful Journeys. Heather, thanks for being on this podcast.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, excited to have a conversation today about stress and fear and navigating those things. So Heather, why don't you start us off by just giving us a brief introduction to your background and some of your experience?
Okay. So I always have mixed feelings about people knowing that I'm the wife of a campus minister. And it's not because I'm ashamed, but it's because I feel like with that comes these preconceived notions of who I may be or what my background might look like. And so I didn't really grow up in the church. I didn't have a great family life. And honestly, I wasn't a Christian, or I didn't become a Christian until I was in college. And so I've definitely had a lot of hardships and struggles. But my husband has been kind of like my saving grace here on earth because he's just a good reminder of what healthy relationships look like. So my home was godless. So we did go to church sometimes. And ironically, I had a grandmother who was a Sunday school teacher on Sunday, but then would tell fortunes and read tarot cards during the week. So This was this crazy environment to grow up in. My mom and dad got divorced literally when I was born. So my dad was an abstinent alcoholic who was more into drugs than his kids. And my mom honestly was lonely and desperate. And so she just kind of went through this string of men, and she's been married 5 times and is on like her 6th now. And so I don't really come from a heritage of a Christ-centered life, really. And so I really had to learn what that looked like. So actually, our home was really bad. It was verbally, physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive. And by the age of 15, I had had enough and I left home. The first time I left, they had the cops bring me back. But I just made it clear I wasn't going to stay. And so honestly, the one good thing my dad did do for me at the age of 15 is he took guardianship of me. But I didn't live with him. He just gave me an out. And so I was super thankful for that. So I worked 2 jobs. I had my first apartment by the age of 16. And honestly, I was struggling to survive. I was starving. The only time I ate was when I worked at a McDonald's and then at a family restaurant. Well, the McDonald's, you had to pay for your food. There's no way I could pay for my food. But at the restaurant, you got at least 1 meal on your shift. And so that's when I ate. So I was always hoping for more shifts at the restaurant than McDonald's. So I got through my junior year that way. And then I realized I was just at the end of my rope, and I was like, man, there's no way I can continue to work 2 jobs and go to school, but I really want to graduate and go to college. And so I reached out to a Christian family who had been a part of my life, and they took me in my senior year, which was super helpful. So they gave me shelter and food, and I was able to just focus on school and getting through. And so it was really cool because I actually graduated with honors and was able to get some scholarships and go to college. And college is where things really started to change for me. It was hard, but I became a Christian at college. And it would take a while for me to really understand grace because I had never really experienced that in my life. But when I did, then I was able to start living in it. And that's when I started to experience some freedom. I was 21 when I got married, so I was pretty young, but I'd been on my own since 15. And so while that seems young, I had grown a lot in that time. And so my husband and I, Mitch is my husband, and we've been at Ferris State University for 23 years doing campus ministry. And so I always make a joke because he's paid full time and I don't get paid, so I'm really good for nothing. So there was a time when I worked full time with the ministry. It's 7 or 8 years. And at that time, I helped develop actually the role of women within our ministry and helped recruit. And I would travel around the state and train women to do ministry on campuses, as well as just doing women's ministry at Ferris. And so I really enjoyed that role. And I think the thing I liked the most about that job was that I actually got to work with the wives while I was on campus. And so being the wife of a campus minister can be pretty lonely. And I also know that just being the wife of a person in ministry can be pretty lonely. And so that really is what brought me to founding Joyful Journeys, because my journey honestly wasn't always joyful. It was a struggle. It was hard to find women I could connect with or people I could even just share a current struggle, whether it was in the ministry or in my marriage or family, because people expect you to be set apart and like you're supposed to be perfect, but you're not. And you don't really have anyone in your corner saying, hey, God's got this and you're going to be okay. And I'm just going to get behind you and rally behind you and cheer you on and help you take your next step. And so really that's what the whole purpose of the organization has become. So, yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you for that. And that from what I know about you and from having several conversations with you, and my wife was obviously involved in the ministry that you and your husband were involved in. And so just hearing bits of your story there really sheds some light on why you're so passionate, so good at being involved in a campus ministry like that. So that's great to know some of those bits. Can you talk us through this idea? I mean, I feel like a lot of people have heard or they have been called life coaches or things like that. Can you talk us through what does it mean to be a life coach? What do you do? How do you help people?
Yeah. So there are many different kinds of life coaches. And honestly, like it's a little bit of a frustration, I think, as a Christian life coach, because it is a buzzword. And so it's really important to emphasize the difference between just a straight up life coach and one who is more spiritually minded.
Yeah.
And so I really think sometimes it's easier to define what a life coach is by giving examples of what it's not. And so like it's not counseling. So counseling is focused on the past and often on trauma and just experiencing healing from those things and really getting a person to a spot where they are emotionally and mentally healed and just solid and able to move on.
Yeah.
But that's not the goal of coaching. And the same like mentoring and discipling as well. That just looks like basically when you're in a mentoring relationship or a discipling relationship, often the person is sharing with you what God has taught them. And then you try to learn from their lessons. And again, coaching isn't really about that. So while those other disciplines can be beneficial at various stages in our lives, and like honestly, I'm all about counseling and I'm all about mentoring and discipling. They all have very specific functions that they serve and they're beneficial, but their emphasis is much different than coaching. So coaching really requires that you start with a healthy person. So honestly, 5 years ago, I would not have been a candidate for coaching because I still had some unresolved issues in my life that needed to be addressed. And I could have had a coach maybe who partnered with me as I walked through counseling, but I really needed to go back and just finally finish or get some resolution with some areas that just were still kind of lingering there.
Yeah.
So you really need to start with a healthy person. And really Christian or Christ-centered coaching takes it one step further because you're really trying to teach or show them what God's trying to do in their life. And so it's more learning to ask questions in a way that draws out of them what God's already placed in them. And it's really a more honoring approach as far as instead of, hey, I got this great experience, let me tell you about it. It's like, no, hey, you're validating their experience and you're validating what God's trying to teach them. And really you're teaching them to become just more empowered in solving their own problems. And so it's kind of like that fable about, you can give a man a fish or you can teach him to fish. And so that's really the approach. And so lots of times people will say, well, is there any crossover between coaching and those other disciplines? I mean, a hardcore coach is going to say no, but that's not honest. I mean, the truth is, yeah. I mean, when the women that I'm working with now, my goal is to always coach them. But there are times when I have to stop and acknowledge what God is doing and maybe play the role of a mentor or maybe play the role of a disciple maker. And so, and even counsel at times, because there are times when you need to seek counsel. But if it's a deep-rooted thing that needs to be addressed, then it's me referring them out and walking alongside them as they do that. And so, yeah, I think just the difference is that you really believe in the person and you really believe in God's ability to work through them. And it's not that those other disciplines don't do that, but it isn't their emphasis. And so, they're more likely to give them things to do, whereas a coach is more likely to draw out of them, what do you want to do? And where is God leading you? And how can we partner with you in that change?
Sure.
So
that makes sense. Is there a specific demographic or type of people that you work with mostly? So
I'm working with various women, but honestly, if my heart is for women who are in ministry or whose spouses are in ministry, or even whose spouses do we call it the marketplace ministry, where you're doing ministry there at work, because they face unique struggles. And really, if you go online, there aren't a lot of resources available to that group. And so, what ages? I don't know. How old are you? If I can help someone take the next step in their relationship with God, that's the goal. And so, so I have, they're all, I would say, between 24 and 40 right now. That's kind of the age range. And I do have some college students I work with, but it's not a lot of coaching. It's more mentoring and discipling. So, yeah.
That's good to know. So where I want to spend the bulk of our conversation is this idea of stress and fear. We're kind of going through this period of time right now with the coronavirus crisis, where the stock market, our economy, you could say it collapsed for a period of time. There's a lot of talk about, it's recovered to a certain extent. There's other areas that people are still very concerned about. There's another shutdown coming, or whatever it would be. And there's a lot of those, questions about stress and fear. So I want to start us off in that conversation by just asking you, can you define for us what is stress and what is fear?
Well, I think that stress and fear are just closely related. And so they're just strong emotions that they really can be caused by numerous things. So, concern or alarm over the economy or what's going to happen with the pandemic or some instability, right? So people are afraid. They're afraid to commit to things because they don't know what it's going to look like even in 2 weeks, because it can change so quickly. And so, and then it influences you. So fear and stress, they influence us, but they impact us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And so really from a Christian's perspective, I think that stress and fear, they often work together, and it is anything really that gets in our lives that can render us ineffective for Christ. So I think there's two types of fear. And, because I think in general, the society might say, well, fear is fear, but as a Christian, that isn't true. So we're supposed to fear the Lord. And so that's the healthy form of fear that we're supposed to have. And I think a lot of people, rather than seeing that as a way to revere God or just stand in how awesome he is and acknowledge that, I think a lot of people kind of develop this intimidation, and that's not what God expects or requires of us. He just wants us to have respect, but to also understand or have a proper understanding of our position before him. Honestly, without him, we have nothing. And so understanding that. And then the second type of fear is just the fear of the world or what it could possibly do to us. So, we live in a fallen world. And so a lot of what we see, we don't often give credit to the person who creates it. And I'm not talking about God. I'm talking about Satan and his rule here. And so we watch people act in fear, and sometimes we're quick to judge, but honestly, they're just responding to what's going on around them. And so as Christians, we're not supposed to fear the world or the things that it could do to us or those we love. And I really, when I was thinking about this a little bit, I was thinking about Peter and just how he's a really good example of that. So, come on, he walked with Jesus. He spent time with him. He sat at his feet. He watched him do miracles. Seriously, if you're going to believe in Jesus, it's going to be someone like that, right? Often I think I wish I could have lived at that time, except you know what? I'm such a skeptic. I would have probably been yeah, no, that's not Jesus. And so, but seriously, so the one thing that stands out to me the most is the time when Jesus sends the disciples ahead of him in the boat. And then there's that big crazy storm, and they look out on the water and they see Jesus walking towards him. And what does Peter do? He calls out and says, let me come to you. Yeah. And so he has this faith and he starts to walk towards Jesus, but he's in that moment, he is focused on him. He's focused on the fact that, yes, he can do this for me. And then what happens? He takes his eyes off of him for just a second. And what's he see? He sees the wind. He sees the waves. He hears the people in the boat probably saying he's insane. And in that moment, he starts to sink and he loses that perspective that he had. And I think that we're the same way. Like as Christians, we know what we should do, but in the moment we just get distracted. And it's when we take our eyes off and we lose that eternal perspective that we really let fear of the world take its hold on us. So yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
You had mentioned COVID, and I think you're right. Many people, especially Christians, sadly, have been operating out of fear. And that creates stress in their lives. And it's really not a surprise. So my thinking has been, to the annoyance of some of my dear friends, is just like, honestly, what's the worst that can happen? I could die? I mean, is death really so bad if we're a Christian? Selfishly, like, yeah, I want to be around. I want to see Gabe graduate next year, and I want to see Nate get married in December, and I want to see my kids grow to honor God with their lives. And yeah, I want to be a part of all that. What I want to do more than anything is spoil grandkids and send them home. Like, I just can't wait for that moment. But honestly, do I want to die? No. Like, I want to see those things, but if that's what God has for me, then who am I to question his motive? And so honestly, the other day I caught myself saying, I wish I'd just get COVID and get it over with, because either I'm going to live or die, and then I won't have that anxiety. But it's a stressor. And where's, as a Christian, you're supposed to be like, oh, life is great. Hey, we have stress too, and we fear. And it's honestly, when I take my eyes off that eternal perspective of what's important, that I allow it to creep in. So
For sure.
So I think the real question is who am I going to serve? Am I going to serve God and keep that eternal perspective, or am I going to let fear rule in my life? So did you know that in Scripture it says, do not fear or do not be afraid 366 times?
I feel like I've heard that at one point in our time or another, but that's a lot.
Yeah, but when you think about it, how many days are in a year?
365 or 66 if it's a leap year.
If it's a leap year, you got one for every day of the year. And so it's just a reminder, like, God doesn't want us to be preoccupied with fear. Mm-hmm. He just wants us to learn to work with him and walk and trust him. And I don't always do that well, if I'm honest. So
sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up the conversation of coronavirus even more, because, I've had conversations with friends that are strong believers and they fall at all different points on the spectrum. I think specifically the whole conversation of wearing masks. And everybody wants to say, well, literally on Sunday, we were having a conversation and one said, if Jesus were here today, he would wear a mask because it's all about other people and loving other people. And a week before that, we had a conversation with another group of friends, and if Jesus was here, he would not wear a mask because, he says, fear not.
Yeah.
Okay. So where do you fall on that spectrum and to be honest with you, I don't think we can really know what Jesus would do because obviously he's not here, but it is just interesting to see that people that have similar worldviews and see the world from a certain standpoint are seeing it completely differently.
Yeah, and it makes me think of Paul when he just says that I've become all things to all people that Christ might be glorified. So honestly, when I'm with my friend who is freaking out and paranoid about the coronavirus, like, I had to visit her and stand and talk to her through the window.
Sure.
Because she was just afraid. Yeah. And my heart would just break, but I honored her in that. And I have another friend who they want us to wear masks when we visit. Fine, I'll wear a mask. Or like when I go to the store. Now my husband, he's boycotting Menards because I'll be if I have to wear a mask to go somewhere, and he's loosened up a little bit. But I'm just like, if that makes somebody else feel more comfortable, I think Christ would have done that. And so my goal is just to show love to people. And so for you, it might, like, I remember talking to Brooke, and just that struggle with how do you do that with different people in the coronavirus, and we all have different views. Look, I'm called to obey Caesar, so to obey the government and to do what they say. So I'm going to follow the law as long as it doesn't conflict with Christ, but I'm also going to show love. And so I'm still going to make meals and drop them on people's porch. I'm still going to make cookies and bring them to the post office. I'm going to put things in the mailbox. Like, I'm not going to stop living life because Christ wouldn't want me to.
Yeah.
So I think just if we can remember that we're supposed to trust God and we're supposed to I mean, the one thing we're asked to do in scripture is to be perfected in love. And so and honestly, that old WWJD, what would Jesus do, but it's true. Like, we don't necessarily know how he would operate, but we do know that he would show love. And so that's just been our focus.
For sure. So we've talked a lot about stress and fear, and specifically what you do as a Christian life coach. If there's somebody listening who doesn't come from a Christian perspective, or they're kind of out there searching and thinking about these things, what first step would you give them as a life coach to start thinking or to really process some of the stuff that's going on now? Okay.
Well, for some of the things that are going on now is a little different.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, if somebody isn't a Christian, then the first thing would just be helping them begin on that journey to understanding who Christ is and having a relationship with him, because I don't see any way that anyone can have peace without Christ. And honestly, like, I wouldn't have had peace during the pandemic if I didn't have a relationship with God.
Sure.
And that's just been true of every area of my life. And honestly, learning to walk in a way that is joyful when the world is chaotic, or in a way that expresses peace, is really challenging. So for a person in that, I think that would be our first step. Does that help you?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think, it's just, I'm sure that the people listening to this are going to be across a broad spectrum. And so I just asked that question to get at some of the, okay, well, I'm searching for something. I feel like there's a lot of people that are at that point right now of just realizing I'm not in control. I don't know what's going on. I don't feel like I can trust media. I don't feel like I can trust the government. Like, what do I turn to? And so I think it's a great conversation to just start scratching the surface of that.
Yeah. And I think really the place to start is just to acknowledge that the fear or stress is there, because a lot of times I think we start to act out or behave in certain ways and we don't even realize why. Like, I'm kind of embarrassed to tell you this, but when I start to get stressed or uptight, I get crabby. And like, we have students that live with us. So we've done discipleship out of our home for 14 years. Okay. And so we're open books. And let me just tell you that this open book isn't always pretty. And so like, I mean, I'll almost become kind of manic. Like, if I feel like life is out of control, I just want to, like, my go-to thing is just to rein it all in and try to grasp control. And then it's really good though, living with other people, because they'll say, "Are you okay?" Like, they realize like your behavior is so out of the norm. But when they do that, it makes me pause and go, okay, something's off. What's stressing me out, or what am I afraid of? And so I really am able to, so fear, I guess, just isn't, it operates as a signal that there's something wrong, or stress too, like, hey, take note. And so there are really, I think, 4 simple steps that anyone could take to address that. And that's the very first step, is just stop and take inventory. Like, what is going on? We like to say trigger. What's triggering me? I'll tell you what's triggering me. You, like, stop asking me. But we want to look at the source, and we want to figure out why we're responding the way we do. And that goes back to being healthy. I mean, after going through lots of trauma-based therapy, I've learned that I respond to things in a way that I learned to survive. And while those survival skills were really good when I was younger, they're not the best survival skills now. And so it makes me stop, take inventory, pause. Okay, what would God have me do? How would he have me handle this situation? So just being mindful of the situation and what's going on. And then the second is to seek truth. And that really applies to anyone. Like, we want to know the truth of the situation. And so this coronavirus pandemic, it's really hard because you don't know who to believe. I feel like I love some of the stuff on social media where, it's like, don't wear a mask because this could happen and blah, blah, blah. But you should wear a mask. And I'm like, but which one is it? And the CDC says, and I'm like, oh my goodness, but the World Health Organization says. And so, with all of these conflicting messages, we don't know what the truth is, but with coronavirus, but we do know what the truth is when it comes to God. And so honestly, just taking time to go to him in prayer, and to ask him to show us his perspective. So if we can just have a perspective that is focused on his truth, then at least there's something stable in our life. Because when everything else is chaotic, you just got to have something you can stand on.
Yep.
And so there's truth there. And then taking it one step further, I think the third step would be then searching his word. And again, whether you're new to Christianity or exploring the option or just really established, we always think we know what we need to know. But I don't know about you, like when you go back and read something you've read before, I always get something new. And I'm like, how did I miss that before? And so just really finding comfort, but also direction in how we should respond. And one of the things that I like to do, and I teach the women that I work with to do, is to search scripture to replace the lies that we're believing with truth. And I mean, honestly, like through my life, I've believed a lot of lies. You know, you're not worthy, or you're not going to ever amount to anything, or, man, you are so broken and damaged. How could God ever love you or use you to do something good? And yet scripture tells me that I'm beloved. It tells me that I am his, that he loved me enough that God loved me enough that he would let his son die for me. And so, I mean, unless you really know what scripture says, you can't live in the truth. And so, and one of the things I do is I put those on note cards, and I kind of get mocked for it sometimes locally, but I have random verses like all over my house.
Sure.
But the cool thing is that I see them all the time and I remind them. And there was a period of time that I even would carry them in my pocket or like my backpack, because I just needed to be able to pull it out and be reminded that I'm loved, that I have worth. And so whatever that truth is that you need, you can find it in God's word, and you can really be grounded in it. Like one of my favorites is Romans 8, where it says, if God is for us, who can be against? Like, I just really struggle with, wow, you know, can I really do this? Whatever. And I'm like, wait a second, like God's asked me to do this. So if he's for me, who's going to take me out? He's bigger than any of them. So, and then just the last thing is sharing your situation. So I think we've just felt really isolated and alone during the COVID thing. Some of us who are introverts, which it might be hard to believe, but I actually am an introvert by nature. I would choose alone over anything else. I kind of like it. But even I crave that human connection. I honestly catch myself talking to my Alexa. Like, and I like one morning I said good morning to Alexa and she didn't respond. And I was like, Alexa, good morning. And then she said good morning. I was like, oh, hey, if I say it this way, Alexa. But it was just like, I just wanted someone other than my husband or my kids to like say something to me. And so God designed us to be in community and to be in relationship. And you see that even as far back as the garden, when he looked at Adam and he was alone, and he was like, it's not good. So we weren't intended to live Christianity as a solo sport, but we often treat it that way. And so does COVID create some obstacles? Sure, but they're not unsurmountable. I mean, so yeah, I stood on the porch and talked to my friend through the window because she needed encouragement. And I would drop off cards of encouragement or baked goods or whatever, like just little things. And I would call them COVID cookies, you know, like eat at your own risk. I'm healthy today, but that could change tomorrow. So, but you have to know the people you're working with and how to do that. But sharing your struggle with someone. So I knew my friend was struggling. So I was able to find ways to encourage her. But had she not told me, I wouldn't have known. And not only encourage her, but I prayed with her. I prayed for her. I texted her regularly, like, hey, how has God shown himself to you today? And those are things I might do intermittently or sporadically just because she's my friend. But when I know she's struggling, I'm really going to get in her corner and come alongside her. And I really think that is really pivotal to our walk with Christ, is learning to walk with others. Yeah, and I'm sure there are plenty of other ways you can handle stress or fear, but I just think that those four are pretty applicable to anybody.
For sure. Yeah, and there's, just to highlight a couple of those things, I think you talked about there's a trigger. You know, you talk about people in your house seeing, she's going nuts. Like, what's going on? And, you know, it's interesting because even on the other end of the spectrum of saying, you know, okay, stress and fear has a trigger. There's a guy out there who runs a blog and wrote a book. His name's James Clear, and he's known as the habits expert. And he talks about habits in the same way as there's got to be a trigger that makes you do whatever your habit is. And so it's interesting to see on both ends that there's those trigger things that are happening. whether we know it or not, or whether we're choosing
Right.
it or not. So that was great information there. And then I just have to say, I'm the extrovert. So this has been interesting to see everyone through little boxes on a computer screen. And that's the conversations that happen. So the other thing that I wanted to highlight just real quickly of what you said was sharing your story. I think that's so important. You know, you've kind of shared that throughout us talking. And I think it's so important. And I think a lot of people have this perception that either Christians or the people around them, that they have to be perfect, that they can't really show that they have flaws. And that's a lie. And to me, that's what it really comes down to is, you know, you've got to bring stuff into the light, so that it can be seen, so that it can be known by other people, whether that creates accountability or whatever it is. There's so much value in sharing that story and having other people know who you are, where you're at, and help you along the way for sure. So those are some great points for sure. Do you have any thoughts on daily routines and the role that they play in walking through this stress or coping with stress or fear?
Yeah, so I'm all about schedules. You want to know a little quirky thing about me? My husband almost walked away from our relationship early on because the first time he asked me on a date, I said, well, let me get my planner and see if I can make that work. Like to him that communicated I just wasn't interested. But to me, I was like, yeah, I'm interested enough that I'll put you in my planner.
Sure.
So I'm all about structure and routine. And it's taken me a long time, honestly, to really develop what I would say a healthy routine for my mornings. And I won't go into all of it, but the biggest thing that I've learned is that I really think, I didn't used to think it mattered when we spent time with God, because honestly, in the past, I had been a night owl and I did some of my prime studying in those late hours. But I've learned as I've learned to become a more mature Christian, I've learned that if I wait and do my Bible reading or study or prayer later in the day, I just missed a whole day that God could have been working and moving, or I could have been acknowledging that God was working or moving because I waited. And so really what I've learned is just start my day in a posture of prayer. And I really think that is effective for anyone, because what it does is it gives us a moment to just reflect on, okay, God, not what can you give me or what can you do for me, but what can I do for you today? And who can you bring into my life? And it's really more of a partnership with God, as opposed to seeing God as that sugar daddy who's supposed to just give you what you want. And it really helps me to focus on God's will over mine, and really his wisdom over my knowledge, and honestly, his strength over my weakness. Because I honestly, people are like all the time telling me, oh, you can do this or you can do that. And God has gifted me in lots of different ways. But I have a lot of weaknesses too. And the hardest thing for me to do is to share those weaknesses. You know, you talked about people don't want to be vulnerable. And so asking him to help me allow him to work through my weaknesses. And King David was just such a good example of that. I'm trying to remember Psalm 5. He just says, no, in the morning, I will go to you. And I used to get annoyed with spiritual leaders who'd be like, you got to read your Bible in the morning and you got to do this. And I don't think you have to, but I think there's great benefit. And so when you put him first, then everything else just seems to fall in place. So really, I talked about being structured. I am a list person. I make lists, and then I make a list for my list. And I just like to accomplish things and get it done, so much so that I have to constantly get myself in check and say, hey, are you more focused on things or on the things of God? And so I've learned to leave empty spaces in my list, which is really hard. So I'll have a list of things I need to do, but I always have a daily list. These are the things I must accomplish today. But I've actually learned to leave a blank space, and I ask God to fill it. And so even my husband is chronically late for things, but he's trying to do better. But I like to leave these spaces around stuff because I can't predict what God's going to do. So you're like, honestly, you're going to the store and you see someone, you probably should give them a ride if like they're broken down and I know everybody's like, oh, something crazy could happen. You're right. It could. But if I feel like God's telling me to do that, I'm going to do that. And so just learning to create space to allow God to move, as opposed to feeling when God says, hey, I'm not saying, well, I don't have time for that today, God, sorry. I had these other things planned. And honestly, like, it's embarrassing to say, but that used to be my approach. I'd be like, I'm too busy to do your work. That's just so messed up. And so, so I really firmly believe that if we don't plan our days, if we don't structure them, you don't have to be a list person like me. Sure. But if you don't start with that posture of prayer, I think you're just really missing out on what God has planned for you. So.
That's good. And I really appreciate the piece that you talk about leaving margin in there. You know, we talk a lot about that in the money world of if you're spending every last penny or every last penny has a place that it's going, what are you going to do when something does come up, whether it's a crisis or it is the person on the side of the road, whatever it is, whether it's time or money, it's the same thing. It's all about that margin and how do we build that into our lives? I think it's a great question to ask ourselves and to meditate on for sure.
Yeah.
So, well, we're coming to the end of our time. So I want to give you the kind of the last thought or a last takeaway. But before you do that, can you just give us, if we want to reach out or find out a little bit more information about Joyful Journeys, where do we go to find that, or how can we get connected with you?
Sure. So my email, you'll appreciate. It's heatherzahoot@gmail.com. Yeah, I like to have fun, and my friends think I'm funny, and I like to think I'm funny sometimes. So, but also I like owls. That's kind of where that comes from.
Gotcha.
And then my website, which should be up and running by the time this goes, is joyful-journeys.org. And so there'll be some information on there just about coaching. There'll be articles on there for encouragement and Bible studies and just different resources that people can use to grow. So
awesome.
Yeah.
So can you give us just a final thought or a final takeaway for this conversation?
I guess really, well, we kind of focused on fear and stress. Yeah. And so like if you have fear and stress in your life, you shouldn't be ashamed of that. We all struggle with different things. And I think that Satan is really good at using our shame to silence us. And so if we can just remember that we aren't called to be perfect in this life, that God is continually perfecting us. And so if anything, embrace your fear, really lean into it and ask God to show you the next step you need to take to grow in that. And really just ask for a friend to partner with you, because you just can't do it alone. And I think that's our greatest mistake. So
for sure. Well, thank you, Heather, for being on the Stewardship Podcast. We appreciate your wisdom and insight that you were able to share with us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for investing in yourself. Remember to connect with us on Facebook by searching The Stewardship Podcast, or email us at thestewardshippodcast@gmail.com. Do you have an interest in connecting with Andrew? Find him on LinkedIn or Facebook, and make sure to join us for the next episode.